Well, this 1991 Cadillac Brougham has been running very well since its transmission replacement, beginning of this year in January. But it has had a few issues since then, and actually a couple of issues. And one of the things is that I had a check engine light come on the dashboard recently, and at the same time, it's been getting pretty cold here, about 25 degrees in the past couple of weeks, and I drove it under those conditions to kind of stress test the vehicle, to bring out anything that might be going on that would be a surprise down the road, and I'm very glad I did. One of the things I've noticed after putting in the new transmission, or shortly after putting in the new transmission, is the lockup torque converter was not engaging. After several miles, 10-15 miles, the engine should have warmed up enough to allow that to happen, and in conjunction with that, the heat was also not working very well at all. And then shortly after that, had a check engine light come on, and turns out that all these problems are basically simple problems. The first problem was, and it was pretty much revealed once I used my infrared thermometer on the thermostat housing. The thermostat had failed, and it's a fail-safe thermostat, and they fail in the open position. After a long drive on the interstate at 70 miles an hour, the radiator barely got above 120 degrees, so this engine's been running really cold. And sure enough, after taking out the thermostat, it failed open. And that's what they look like when they fail. And most of them will fail open. The good thermostats will fail open, and that way the engine doesn't overheat. So it was just running wide open, maximum cooling, not letting the engine reach proper operating temperature. And this is a fuel-injected car, believe it or not, throttle body injected car. And if this coolant temperature sensor does not register a certain amount, it's not going to let the computer go into closed loop. It'll still think the engine is in a cold warm-up cycle. And various things happen during that warm-up cycle. The torque converter is not going to lock up to prevent drivability concerns, as well as other features may not operate, such as the air pump, maybe the EGR valve, things like that. So after replacing the thermostat, I got really good heat. The torque converter started to engage like it should. I got a little bit concerned there because, as with any new part that you put on there, especially something as complicated as a transmission, you don't want to have any problems afterwards, and I thought that I had to take the entire thing back out again, replace the converter, or figure out what was going on with it. Fortunately, it was just a thermostat problem, but because the transmission previously was in such bad shape, slipping all over the place, it wasn't really obvious what the thing was doing. But the transmission wasn't operating properly to begin with, which kind of masked the problem with the thermostat. And to complicate that, this car, although I really do love this car, I've always wanted one, one of the downsides is there's just no full gauge complement. You've got a row of warning lights across here, but no temperature gauge, no oil pressure gauge, anything like that. So you will get a temperature light come on if the engine overheats, but the opposite is not true. If the engine runs too cold, you really never know about it unless it's really cold outside and you try to get some heat going and it doesn't really perform like it should. So that was a telltale sign. I think in the future, as part of my routine maintenance, I'm going to go ahead and always just use my thermometer and measure the temperature of the radiator, as well as feel the hose, just to keep an eye on that thermostat so that it doesn't fail, or if it does fail, replace it as soon as I can. It's not good to run an engine really cold like that. All the parts in there are tight. The anti-wear additives and the motor oil don't really take maximum effect at those temperatures. you're not really able to burn off a lot of the condensation that comes into play when the engine's warming up, when it's cold like that. So it just causes lots of problems that you just don't want. Cooler is not always better. And by the way, you want to go with a 195 degree thermostat. That's the factory specification. So that's all squared away. But getting back to the original purpose of the video, it's got a check engine light after warm-up when it tries to go into closed loop and operate the EGR valve, and it's a code 32. And it turns out that I've got an EGR problem, and there is a light pinging in the engine. And one of the symptoms of an EGR not operating properly is excessively high combustion temperatures, some detonation, pinging, things like that. Sorry for the shaky camera. It's pretty cold out here, about 35 degrees. So I've got to basically replace the EGR valve. I've already diagnosed it. Basically, the operation is pretty straightforward of these things. You've got a vacuum source coming off of the throttle body, and this is a 350 Chevrolet engine. Basically, it's used in a lot of GM vehicles of the era, so this should be able to apply to Chevy trucks, Suburbans, Oldsmobiles, other kinds of cars as well. But you got a vacuum source here, and it tees off to the air pump diverter valve, and it also runs along here and goes to the EGR control valve solenoid right here. It's just a solenoid with two outputs on it. One's a vacuum source, and the other one goes to the EGR valve. And what this does is the ECM or PCM, the engine control computer, turns this valve on and off many times a second to regulate the amount of lift on this pintle valve in here, to control the amount of exhaust flow based on a variety of conditions. I've got this connector removed here for the, I think the idle air control valve, just to make things a little bit easier to get to. And they're not really too hard to test. I went ahead and disconnected the electrical connector and put a vacuum source on here and listened for a click and to see if my vacuum immediately went down, which it did. So I know the vacuum solenoid is okay. And I know that I've got good vacuum here with these lines. They're not cracked or anything like that. But when I put my vacuum pump on the valve, the pintle didn't move up and down. Now these valves are a little bit interesting. According to the service manual, there's 3 types on these engines. There's a kind of like a neutral valve or ported valve. Then there's a negative back pressure valve, which this one is. And then there's a positive back pressure valve, which I don't have. And it basically kind of balances between the vacuum source and the negative back pressure in the exhaust coming through here to precisely meter the amount of exhaust flow to the engine. If you get too much, the engine just goes ahead and stalls because there's not enough fuel getting into the manifold. So what we want to do is go ahead and remove this. And it's a little bit tight in there. You've got one bolt right here, and on the other side you got another bolt right here. And because you're dealing with high temperatures and exhaust and things, this area tends to rust out. So I went ahead, you're going to want to clean this area as best you can with a wire brush and then spray some penetrating lube on there. And then you're going to want to get a 1/2 inch or 13 millimeter open end wrench, or actually box wrench, to get this thing loose. So we'll start by getting the vacuum source off of here. I've already broken these bolts loose, these nuts, just to make it a little bit easier in the video. And they're pretty well greasy from the penetrating oil, which is just what I wanted. Now this one back here is a little bit more tricky. You've got this fuel line coming in here that you're going to have to work around. But once you clean these things off and use the penetrating lube, you should be able to use your fingers to spin these nuts off. And I felt that valve move, which is good. I don't think I'll have to fight with it too much. And you just want to slowly walk it off of here. Don't be surprised if you see a bunch of crud come out. And she's out. Get out here in the light and look at it. That actually doesn't look too bad as far as buildup. Just a little bit. Looking at the how you can tell if it's a ported valve or a negative back pressure valve. You want to look at those last three numbers on the bottom right there, 02N. That means this valve was made in 1990, and the N is negative back pressure. If you had a positive back pressure valve, you would have a P, and if you had no character on the end, you would have a ported valve. And basically what this does, there's a little diaphragm in here, and it moves this little valve inside. And after diagnosing, I'll show you what happens. I've got a little handheld vacuum pump here, and we'll go ahead and connect it as best we can with one hand. And what you want to look for, and you can do this on the engine, and this is how I diagnosed it. And it's a very typical failure. These diaphragms, they live a hard life in this kind of environment where you have such big temperature extremes with the exhaust. They just rupture and don't allow the valve to move. But what you're looking for is this diaphragm to go inward as you apply vacuum. And it just doesn't do anything. You can even hear the hissing. So this EGR valve was stuck closed, which set the code. I've got a new EGR valve. I tried to go with AC Delco. Despite my best efforts, it's still made in China, unfortunately. The thermostat, I went in with a Stant Superstat, or rebranded Napa, and it's actually made in USA, so 50-50, I guess. Try to do the best I can with using American parts on an American car. We'll go ahead and test this valve and contrast the difference here, and you'll be able to see how what this thing is supposed to do. Moves nicely. When I move this lever in, it should release the vacuum very slowly. And we know we figured out what the issue is with that code. One of the other things that you want to do that I forgot to mention when you're testing this, another common failure because of the hard life these things live, and you probably can't see in there these two ports, but these ports typically get clogged up. There's just like on most V8s, there's an exhaust crossover passage going through here from the head, and a lot of times that'll get clogged up, and you might have a good EGR valve and good control system, but the valve just, even though it opens up fully, since it's blocked in the passages, you have the same symptoms, a check engine light code 32. So after you get through checking the solenoid, what you want to do is you can come to this valve and you can put your fingers in here with the engine running at normal operating temperature and start pressing on it, lifting it up just a little bit, and you should hear the engine start to stall out because you're just running it idle and you're diluting the fuel air mixture. If the engine stalls out or starts to run really rough, and then when you let go the engine comes back up to normal smooth running speed, you know that your exhaust passages are clear. And I did that on this car and I got lucky. It's the engine basically stalled out on me when I lifted it up. So I'm going to go ahead and with the new valve. I'm going to clean up these threads even better than I did now that they're all exposed. I'll put some anti-seize on there. Put a new gasket on, which comes with this kit. And we'll go for a test drive. Well, there's what the new valve looks like all installed. You can see a little bit of the anti-seize I have on the bolts or the nuts, so in case this valve has to come out again, or the intake manifold has to come off, these, rest assured I'll be able to get these nuts off pretty easily without rounding it off or anything. And I'm happy to report that the code 32 check engine light is off and the problem's fixed. So this was fairly straightforward to do as far as jobs go on cars. It's nice to be able to start doing some more lighter type work versus changing transmissions. But the trickiest nut to get was right here where the fuel line is. You kind of have to use your wrench and loosen it to one spot, take it off, move it over to this other spot, and continue on. A little bit time consuming, but not all that bad. I've certainly had harder valves to get off. But anyway, just wanted to kind of share the progress of this restoration with this car. There's really not much that has to be done with it. It's in such beautiful condition, but it's interesting to discover all the little problems that tend to come up with cars that are 25 years old. Other than the transmission, everything on this thing has been fairly straightforward and easy. Just typical old car problems. The car is 25 years old, so you know, the diaphragms and these kinds of valves tend to dry out and crack over time and things like that. Thermostat failures are very typical, so really no big deal, no showstoppers so far. And hopefully no more failures. The next thing I'm going to do when the weather gets a little bit nicer is go ahead and do a tune-up and change all the spark plugs in here. I'm not sure how long it's been since that was done, but definitely want to go in with new plugs, make sure they're gapped properly and have the right heat range. So if any of you have a 91 Cadillac Brougham like this, or pretty much any Chevrolet LO5 350 engine with a code 32 check engine light, you want to focus in on the EGR system and more than likely either replace the valve or clean the ports.